So this isn't new, and what I'm going to be talking about is a pilot project that we are in the middle of. So SPARC Europe is taking something forward. The coalition is called the Global Sustainability Coalition for Open Science Services. You might say, this isn't new, we've been talking about this for a long time. We need to fund essential infrastructure services. The services that publishers also rely on, like Sherpa Romeo or DOAJ or other services, non-profit services that started as projects. So there's been a lot of talking about this. Knowledge Exchange has done some great work. There's also been a report done, and I think the report writer's even in the room, that it's essential that we do something with this. Well, SPARC Europe last year, with a coalition of international organizations, said, right, let's do it. Let's have a look and see whether it's possible. It's an experiment. So as I say, we're in the middle of a pilot, so I can't report on the final results, but stay with me. And let me take you through the process. So as I say, it's a pilot, and let me take you to the context. So I think Louise also mentioned a couple of these things, and actually we've heard some of this morning as well. First off, though, we know that in this area of open science and open access, there is a huge or a humongous amount of projects and innovation going on. And if you're lucky, very lucky, your project may get renewed funding, but that's actually the exception. And but if your project, which is a service, becomes a service and is successful, what then? I've talked to numerous projects thinking, wow, that's a fantastic infrastructure for the future. And I say, well, what happens in 2 years once the project funding has stopped? And they said, well, we're not quite sure. Mostly, projects have to have some idea about how they're going to sustain themselves, but it is a huge challenge, particularly if things are born together by libraries, non-profit institutions. So the project normally has a beginning, middle, and an end, but a service doesn't. And if it's successful, what do you do then? So this is a challenge that we have, because there are some really very essential services that have stemmed from projects that have been then maintained by perhaps the key lead organization of that project, but they are at risk in some instances where that institution no longer can continue or can say to its board members, yes, we should continue funding for this, because most of the users are actually coming from all over the world, or this isn't really in our local interests. But this is essential infrastructure for open science, for you as publishers as well. So what do we do in that case? We think as a coalition that the community, so the user community and the service community that supports those users, we have the responsibility to see whether we can fund it collectively to ensure that there is some further sustainability of such services. So, another challenge with this is you've got publisher diversification. So the challenge here is, as you all know, there are some fantastic services that have been developed, such as Bpress or Mendeley, Converis, and Publons. And they have been then bought up by certain publishers, and actually their service models are no longer secure. The service models we knew and loved have changed, perhaps not for the better, should I put it in that way? And we also want to try to prevent that from happening. So if the community can ensure the service lives to support our interests, that's what we are seeking to do with this initiative. Furthermore, Cameron Naylan and others in 2015 also set up, if you don't know this, it's actually a very short piece, Principles for Open Scholarly Infrastructure. So how do you know who to trust and rely on when they provide infrastructure? What are some guiding principles that if you are setting up an infrastructure or maintaining it, that you should abide by? So you should be transparent. also about your operations. You should represent your users in your governance model, etc., etc. So he has some very interesting principles, and we've based our principles also on his. So please do have a look at this if you don't yet know these principles. They're really important for sustainable infrastructures. And so before I show you what we're doing, the real challenge and risk is that we are controlled by a small few, and we don't want to be locked in. So we want to have more independence, and that the community decides on the infrastructure that they feel that needs to support them, but as well, that infrastructure is important for publishers too. So how can we better guarantee that? So SCOS, this coalition, ultimately the goal is to sustain the infrastructure to support the implementation of open science. So think about the funder policies, your institutional policies. A lot of those are dependent on infrastructure. As I mentioned, for example, Sherpa Romeo or DOAJ. So how can we help sustain that important infrastructure to be able to implement policy? So SCOS, what it is basically, it's a group of organizations that evaluate certain services. For the pilot, we've chosen two. I've already mentioned them, Sherpa Romeo and DOAJ. But there will be others in the future if the pilot is successful. So we evaluate the services. I'll tell you how. And then ultimately, we then go to the community, to our user communities, to our member organizations, and we say, here is a stamp of approval. There is evidence that these infrastructures are very meaningful and are important. Please contribute X amount of funding to sponsor them. So, who's behind this? Because, of course, this is really important. This was developed, I think we started last year in September. We sat together. So it's actually a group of library organizations. So you've got IFLA or LIBA, which is the European Research Library Organization, SPARC Europe, of course. EIFL, who's also really important, and SPARC. But we also have the Australian Open Access Strategy Group and Council of Australian University Librarians. We felt that it's a global issue. People are using these services globally, so it needs to have the global players behind also deciding on what they should look like to serve their users and needs. But not only that, we also have the research community who also has been working with us on how to develop this concept. So we have the European University Association, the European Research Council, and Science Europe. So why are they interested in joining? Apart from, obviously, I've sold perhaps a little bit why this is important, but what they told us also is it's really important for the majority to help sustain OA. It's now open science, but OA and open science services. It's also important to discuss sustainable funding, which often isn't done, so different models for such services. That was important for Science Europe, for example. It's seen as a priority, anything related to sustainability, because it's not a popular topic and it's not often addressed. So we feel that we really need to look at that and focus on that. For the European Research Council, for example, they have funding, but they don't know where to put it. So they need so they'd rather have some, rather than providing ad hoc funding to certain services, they want a more strategic approach and structured recommendations on who to fund and why. Which translates into also other practitioners. So, for example, individual libraries also need guidance on what to fund. So through such an initiative also, you gain a new ability to fund services, which you hadn't perhaps had before. LIBE sees this perhaps as a cost saving for libraries, and we have to see whether that will be proven. What's also important, and through the evaluation process, is to also monitor and assess the services. Where are they going? What are their plans? What are their costs? So looking at the value that those services provide and analyzing and understanding what goes into those services. And what's also important, which LIBE mentioned, was to have a space to voice library needs amongst other global players, so also amongst the research councils or Science Europe, to talk about open science from the perspective of the library world. And what's also important for many of us is to work collaboratively and internationally on a bigger goal which we couldn't achieve alone. So I think we heard already a couple of examples. What's really key in the open access and open science world is to bring stakeholders together and to really work together for a bigger goal. So although not all of these players are involved yet, you have the open access and open science support institutions, and I already mentioned libraries, but also research institutions, funders. So if they are specifying policy and to implement that policy, you need certain services. We also see them contributing to the costs of this infrastructure. Research assessment bodies, similarly, like with HEFCE in the UK, for example, and obviously the service institutions are obvious partners. So partnerships, more partnerships with many different actors, it does make it challenging. And I'll come to that in a minute. So let me tell you briefly about the development process of this. So I think I mentioned it started off really with the great work of knowledge exchange, and there was a report called Putting Down Roots, Securing the Future of Open Access Policies. So if you haven't read it, please do have a look. It makes the case for why this is important. And then we wanted to take action to see whether this is possible, and we got a coalition together, and I already mentioned it was important to have representatives from across the world, at least to develop the concept. We then developed terms of reference and set out the business case for this to share with our boards, to get them to buy into the idea or not. What would an application look like from a service? What kind of information would we need to be able to evaluate and assess whether that they are worth funding? So we also looked at it on a practical level. What was really key for the organizations, and also probably for you, is to know who is behind it and how is the governance going to be managed. How can we trust SCOS and the decisions you're making? And then we together specified that we were going to start a pilot once we had defined the case and agreed together on the case, the terms of reference, and the governance structure. So perhaps some of you are interested. So briefly, the governance structure we have in place, we have the executive group, which basically manages the process and communications about SCOS. We have a board with representatives, not of all of the people who I mentioned who were developing the process. A selection of those are on board for the pilot, and they make the decisions on whether one recommends X or Y, and they also the advisory group feeds in recommendations. They analyze and evaluate the applications as according to certain criteria. They make recommendations to the board. And we also have a registry of open access services and open science services we're developing together also with Australia. So we're looking at what kind of services are available and what might need funding in the future. But it doesn't mean that in the future other services can approach us who don't appear on the registry, of course. So how do we evaluate applications? For the pilot, at least, we've been learning. So we set evaluation criteria. I'll show you what those are in a second. Evaluators, they come from 5 organizations that I showed you from around the world. We use a 5-point scale, and the threshold is 3 that you need to achieve on all elements of the evaluation criteria. We need to reach consensus together on what we decide on that particular application, and we then feed back to the applicants. And after this pilot, we review the evaluation procedure, whether it's running well or not. So the evaluation criteria we have, so we ask, for this pilot, we asked Sherpa Romeo and DOAJ to provide us information generally on the scope and how they fit into the Nayland principles. What are their goals and what's the value proposition? What value do they bring to a range of communities, to the research community, to the library community, to authors, to publishers? They need to specify this very clearly to the group. They also need to provide us with technical details, so not just statistics, but also the software they use, the hardware, a number of elements to check the technical strength of the services. Costs I'll come to in a minute, so it's very important also to know if they want so much funding, what is it based on? How are they governed? Do they represent the users in their governance structure? What sustainability measures have they in place or are planning? What are their plans? So if you're asking for money for the next 2 years of funding, which is the case, and 1 year in the bank, what are you planning? Are you just sustaining the normal business, or are you planning to add a lot more data, new services, etc.? What happens if we don't finance you? Do you then shut down, or do you go elsewhere? We want to know that too, yes? And then the score I already told you about. Really? Okay, so we have an application form. So the evaluation criteria is obviously put into the application form that needs to be filled in. The evaluators also have very clear guidelines on what they need to do and that they need to comply with our evaluation procedure so that it's fair. Now, as regards costs, we have also asked for quite a bit of information from these services, which came as a little bit of a shock, I have to say, to some. So what we wanted to see was the approved financial report of the previous year and the organizational budget for 2 years. So what expenses and what income, to give us an indication. We are also, what's key for the group is to find out, well, if we agree to that these services are providing excellence and they are necessary for our infrastructures, okay, we are willing to pay, but how much? So we've also developed a flat rate fee. This is the proposal at the moment on the table, but this still needs approval from our boards. Okay? Yeah, so I think I summarized. We invited DOAJ and Sherpa Romeo to apply. They sent us their proposals. We evaluated those, had consensus meetings, and we discussed the funding model, and we're now awaiting for the final approval. Once we have final approval from our boards, we will then go out to our members and invite you to fund these services. So, we're waiting for our boards. Can I just have a couple of more minutes about challenges? So, interestingly enough, actually, Louise talked about speedboats. Some of you know me, and I'm probably a bit more of a speedboat than an oil tanker, but we've had some challenges with oil tankers and speedboats. So, oil tankers, you could see as a metaphor for the very big organizations that need time to process, to move forward. And then some of the innovators amongst us, and I think there are plenty of speedboats in here, you need to maneuver, and you need to move those oil tankers in the right direction. But once you have moved that oil tanker in the right direction, it's hard to stop them. So this is what we are trying to do together, to align, to move forward, to fund such infrastructure. So that's been a challenge from a time perspective. What's also going to be challenging in the future, it's global responsibility and participation. We also see user figures often from across the world, but who's going to pay? There should be a fair distribution of who is paying from the different continents. We can't expect the same from Asia or Africa, but the richer countries certainly should make their commitment known. What's also going to be a challenge, the funding targets of those services, are we going to reach those? But we need to measure the effectiveness then of SCOS and to follow how much funding are we gathering from you all, and how can are we reaching those big targets? And the last one, I think the challenge has also been for the service providers themselves, so asking for all the details on the costs, on the benefits to certain communities, etc. It's been a learning experience for them too, but they found it quite helpful to get that very clear and to start a new process within their organizations to get that straight, if you like. So I think that's the end of my talk, and look forward to your questions afterwards. Thank you. Thank you very much.
So, Paul was asked to talk about the work that we're doing on open tools, open infrastructure to support digital continuous publication. So that's what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to begin with a little introduction, and that's Paul's email. So if you've got really hard questions, that's where to send them. I'll say a very few words about eLife by way of introduction, and begin with the words of Sir Mark Walpott, who was one of the inspirations behind the sort of conception of eLife, as was Robert Kiley, actually, who's in the room. But one of the things that Sir Mark said was that he wanted eLife to be a place... Actually, I don't need this, do I? You told me I don't need this. He wanted eLife to be a place where we could experiment and innovate, fail sometimes, have permission to fail, but also to succeed sometimes too, in an effort to just try and make journals work better and to share as much as what we produce as possible. So he shared that kind of vision with two other funders, the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, the Max Planck Society, and they made the decision to launch eLife as an initiative in research communication, as a collaboration between funders and the research community. And these are the kinds of issues that they wanted eLife to at least explore and address if we possibly could. I won't go through them because we've heard them all before today. So those are the issues that we wanted to kind of explore, how we might do better, how we might make publishing better. And the way we think of this is our mission statement. It's on the wall in the office. So fundamentally what we see ourselves as being here for is to help science, help scientists, accelerate discovery, and we want to do that by operating the kind of research communication platform which would help to encourage and recognize the most responsible behaviors in science, which is something that currently publishing, through no fault of publishing, it's just the way publishing sits within the incentive system, publishing doesn't currently do that. And the kinds of behaviors we're talking about are things like sharing data and the outputs of research generally more openly and effectively, more objective and complete reporting of research findings, putting greater emphasis on cooperation and collaboration as opposed to competition, providing constructive feedback and encouragement to colleagues. That's the kind of thing. If we could possibly help to shift things in those directions, that would be wonderful. So eLife has a journal, but we also increasingly are investing time, money, effort into the development of tools and infrastructure. So I'm going to talk very briefly about 4 aspects of that work. So the first is something which we call the Innovation Initiative, which is a way in which we collaborate with sort of slightly smaller scale projects We highlight smaller scale projects, often driven from within the scientific community. We have a page called eLife Labs, so if you want to find out more about some of these things, I encourage you to go there, sign up for the technology newsletter. If you wish, we won't bombard you with emails, I promise. So just a couple of the things that we've helped work with. So Science Fair is a project that was launched quite recently, a couple of months ago. And this is building on an open source product that eLife produced a few years ago called the eLife Lens Reader. And the Lens Reader is just a different way of consuming content as a kind of a pair of panels where you're looking at a narrative down one panel and display items or references down the other panel. If you go to the eLife website and click the side-by-side link on any article, that's the Lens Reader. Science Fair is an evolution of that, which is an offline version. So you don't have to be online anymore. You can download the XML locally, and then you can read papers offline. Now, at the moment, that's limited to eLife content, but soon it will be working with the whole of the open subset of PubMed Central. So it will be a great demonstration, I think, of a way in which open content can be repurposed for a different kind of reading experience. Another collaboration that we have is with, I'll carry on, is with Hypothesis. We heard about Hypothesis this morning. So the work we've been doing there is to collaborate with Hypothesis on the deployment of these annotation tools. So the Hypothesis tools we heard are very general, covering annotation on any content on the web. So we thought there was some thought that could be put into adapting those tools a bit for scholarly communication. And so we've added a kind of a publishing version of this, a version that's suitable for a work with scholarly content. And so it's very much in addition to all the things that Hypothesis already does. But it means that publishers can have a bit more control over things like who can add annotations or comments to articles, what kind of moderation you can then apply to those comments, which are things that publishers care about, and also the way it looks in relation to the journal content or the scholarly content. So that's not, we haven't quite done that yet, but that's coming very shortly. And then the last one I want to mention is a project called Refigure, which is absolutely born within the scientific community. There's a couple of postdocs in Boston who we felt had a really interesting idea. The thing that they were particularly interested in was that if you imagine you go to a paper, you see a figure in a paper, and you might want to know, how reliable is that finding? Well, it turns out that probably, quite often, that finding has been reproduced or built upon in another paper. And so they wanted a simple way to make that link between that paper, that figure, and a subsequent figure in another paper. So that's the one particular use case they were thinking about. So we thought that was a really interesting idea, and we provided them some support, both financial, but more importantly, probably also mentoring in some cases with respect to design aspects and technology aspects to get them to the point of prototype, which has recently been launched. So now it's a question of seeing what people make of this, how it's used, et cetera, how successful it is, and then we can work with them to figure out where to go next. So that's the innovation initiative. We also take on some substantial projects as well ourselves. So this is something which is really a 2-year project called eLife Continuum, which was released a couple of months ago. And this is a publishing and hosting platform, an open source publishing and hosting platform. And the goal is to really try and produce something which enables publishers to do as much as they could possibly want to do with the content that they publish. Because we felt, from a design perspective, and this, one of the key people in this project is our head of product called Giuliano Macciocci, who, again, is not someone that comes from the world of scholarly communication. He's been with us now for 2 years, so he's immersed and embedded in it, but he brought a strict and rigorous UX design process to eLife, and really helped to drive the design aspects of this. So it's modular. it is flexible in the way that content can be presented, not just to humans, but also to machines, which is a really important aspect of, everything open access as well. So our sort of vision for where we want to take this is all very well, it works in the context of eLife, but this is an open source project, and as we've heard, it's incredibly important that this is, we can build a community around this. So that's why things are open source. So that's what we want this to evolve into. And so that people can use it, other organizations can use it either, if they have technological capability, then they could just take the tools and use them, or some of them, or whatever. But also we're working very closely now with Digirati, actually. So John Baker is here from Digirati, who has worked over the past 2 years on this project, helping us to, working with us to develop this. So we are now working together on making it more generic. De-eLifing it is a phrase that we use, so that it's more usable by others. And the success ultimately will be determined by how much usage is actually generated. More information on these kinds of open source tools there. This is a kind of very sort of simple-minded, in a way, diagram of the way publishing works. When Paul first arrived, he said, okay, so how does it work? What's the process here? And so he said, well, basically, it's like that. And so, so the continuum part is the end part that deals with publishing and hosting. It has both production tools for the production team to help monitor content through into the publishing and hosting environment, and then of course it delivers content to a journal website. This was where we were about a year and a bit ago with actually the first version of Continuum before we'd really gone into the redesign, and that's where we are now. So one of the big things about Continuum is that it's absolutely a mobile-first platform, and you can kind of see this in action if you look at any page. If you look at an article and you squash your screen down to the size of a mobile phone, you can see how the content's reorganized and stuff. So it's a very responsive design. It's, as I say, driven very much by user experience, so there's a lot of user testing that's gone into this, and the feedback's been great. So the homepage, there's very little web page furniture, as the designers say, so the distractions are removed. The content is front and center. There's a lot of attention being paid to things like font hierarchy, so your eye is drawn towards the most useful, what we perceive to be the most useful aspects. And that's what articles look like. So again, that's just emphasizing the kind of the multi-platform support for this thing. And I'll just skip over this. This is just like before on the right, after on the left. Clean design, content first, carried throughout the site, whether it's subject-based pages or search results or any other kind of article list or content. And then my last slide on this bit is a very complicated slide, which I'm obviously not going to go through, but the point I wanted to make is that all of those little boxes are kind of modular sort of components to it. The green bits, the light green bits are the bits that you basically need to publish research content. Everything else are different kinds of things like, people pages or interviews or whatever. The content is then delivered to the journal website via a collection of APIs, so the API gateway. That means you can, if you don't want to use the front end, you don't have to. So it's kind of you can kind of cut it in all directions, really. And the journal itself the design is driven by a technology called Pattern Labs. And the beauty of Pattern Labs is it constructs pages out of a series of patterns, and those patterns can be reused throughout the site. So if you want to change an aspect of a pattern, it's then propagated throughout the site in a really sort of straightforward way, and it helps to maintain the integrity of the design. So we think we get great feedback so far on the quality of the technology. So far so good, but as I say, there's a lot to do in terms of helping to make this. Louise said it right. Open source is not enough. It's exactly like open access is not enough. You've got to go further if you really want to promote effective reuse. So the third little project is on reproducible documents. So Continuum is fine, but it's still focused on somewhat flat articles in a journal. We think it's a really nice way to present and organize that content, but they're just articles as we know them. Increasingly, we're seeing more attention being paid, more data-driven science, which incorporates both data, code, workflows. How could we imagine publishing which incorporates those kinds of elements in addition to the narrative and the figures? So we have recently launched a collaboration with Substance, the Substance Consortium, which we're now a member of. Substance are the developers who were responsible originally for eLife Lens, the Lens reader, so we worked with them on that. And they've since gone on to do really build on eLife Lens in interesting ways to develop web-based editing tools and so on. So we're working with Substance and Stencilla to see if we can really kind of develop this idea of reproducible documents. This is one of Giuliano's slides. It's just a sort of schematic to illustrate a concept called, what's it called? Progressive enhancement. So the idea is that, you depending on your needs as a user or the device that you're viewing the content on, the presentation of that content will vary. So progressive enhancement. So it might begin with a sort of flat version of the figure, number one, and a more interactive version in number two, where you can adjust axes or whatever. Number three, which you can't see any bits inside, but number three is supposed to represent the idea that if you wanted to get into the data or the code behind that figure, then that you'd be able to do that. And then, if you ultimately wanted to rerun the experiment, then that's number four. So there's different, there's this sort of progressive enhancement approach. There are tools already which are helping move in that direction. So Stencilla itself is an authoring tool, a collaborative authoring tool, which allows you to incorporate data and code into the figures. So you can reproduce, you can sort of recreate the way that figure was generated. It's also importantly aimed not at the real geeks, but at people who know how to use Word or Excel. It doesn't require huge amounts of coding ability to use it. So we want to work very closely with Stencilla. We also recognize that there are other platforms and tools for this kind of work. So there's Jupyter Notebooks, there's our Markdown tools as well, that also allow data and code to be incorporated into reproducible figures. So, our goal over the next year is to see if we can get to some kind of working prototype which goes from one end to the other, so all the way from authoring through to publication. So it won't be the finished thing, but it will be at least a prototype which will hopefully stimulate some ideas along the way. There was something else I was going to say, but I've forgotten what it was. Never mind. Yeah, okay, I'll just move on. So the last thing, the last number 4, is a project called eLife XPub. And this is something actually which we're announcing today. So this is a collaboration, another collaboration. I think collaboration is definitely a theme of this meeting already. So this is a collaboration between eLife and COCO, or the Collaborative Knowledge Foundation. So COCO are also really committed to and making great progress in the development of open infrastructure tools to support scholarly communication. So we're collaborating with them on some more infrastructure. Now, what COCO, their kind of general approach is to really think very generically about scholarly communication broadly. So they're developing. They work in a very component-based way. These components are very generic. They can be deployed in different ways to support different kinds of scholarly communication, books, journals, micro-publications, whatever anyone else might dream up. So the idea is to be very generic. And then they view these tools in a way as a platform from which to build publishing platforms. And so our job in this collaboration is to work together to come up with a journals platform specifically to support the editorial and peer review process. So, these are just 2 screenshots just to make the point that these tools are already they work at a kind of rudimentary level, so they're not, again, the finished article, but they have made a lot of progress in different kinds of areas. So this is a prototype of the submission dashboard, and there's a rudimentary peer review process that's supported as well. Lots to do. So this is another kind of big scale collaboration and long-term project. So Continuum is focused on the right-hand end of the simple diagram, and then these other tools will be focused on the left-hand end. Now, so the other point I wanted to make here, of course, is that this whole thing is changing, and the order of these events is changing. We're going to hear, we've heard already, and we're going to hear more tomorrow about the way in which publishing and hosting can basically take place at or before submission in the form of preprints. So there's all sorts of ways in which this process might change, which I think, again, speaks to why it's important to have tools that are modular and you can remix them in different kinds of configurations. So the second to last slide. This is a slide that is Kristen Rattan's, who's one of the co-founders of COCO, along with Adam Hyde. And the point here is to say that there is this growing ecosystem of open infrastructure tools to support research communication. And we think that is really exciting. There are big and important questions to answer around sustainability, governance. These are weighty issues that we need to address. But there is this great potential as well to create tools around which a community of users can coalesce and collaborate. In the same way that open source software operates in other spheres of life. So there's no reason to say it won't work. But what's critical is building that community. That's right. One thing I didn't say about COCO is that unlike the Continuum project, which was really we were thinking generically, but really we wanted to support what eLife needed, and now we're trying to make it more generic. The COCO project is kind of working a bit the other way around. The tools are very generic, and we're now trying to turn them into the specific thing that eLife needs. The other important thing is that it's already a community. It's a small community, but University of California Press has already worked with COCO to develop this editoria platform for books, for example. So, we think there is great potential here to build communities and work together. And then the final slide is just a reminder about why we're doing any of this. And so the last words go to Randy Shepman, who's as they often do, to our editor-in-chief. It's not being recorded, is it? So yes, we're doing this to support science. So thank you very much.
So I'm very pleased to be here and very grateful to Katrina for the invitation. I just want to take her up on her opening remark that infrastructure is something built by publishers that researchers know nothing about. I hope to tell you about some infrastructure that researchers build. So I want to talk about two things today: the Initiative for Open Citations and the OpenCitations Corpus, which are related but separate. But they both relate to the openness of citation data, of the references that we make to other people's work. And I don't have to persuade this audience that open scholarship is a public good. And part of that is open citation information. Citations are the things whereby we give credit to people's work that has gone before our own. They're the things that knit together our independent acts of scholarship into a global community and form a citation network in which we can evaluate the birth of new disciplines and changes in research effort and so on. It wasn't so long ago, those of you who are my generation will remember, when the abstracts of journal articles weren't necessarily open. We take that as a given today. And in the projects that I'm going to describe, we strive for that same openness for citation data. So it was 4 years ago when I first came to the COAS conference in Riga and made a plea for freeing citation data. And there I felt a little bit like John the Baptist, a voice crying in the wilderness. There were lots of encouraging noises from publishers, but very little in the way of activity. Last year, in Richmond, Dario Taraborelli spoke to you, and again, as part of a wider talk, made the cry, release open citations data. And I have to say that it's largely due to his efforts that I'm here today to talk to you about the Initiative for Open Citations. This year is a year of success. It's a year in which citation data has at least partially begun to be free. There are two separate but related fantastic success stories: the Initiative for Open Citations and the OpenCitations Corpus. And there are two Italian heroes in that, Dario and my colleague Silvio at the University of Bologna. Before I go into those two things, I just, for completeness, want to fly the flag for Crossref. Crossref provides the fundamental infrastructure that makes lots of what we do possible. It is, as you know, the registration agency whereby DOIs are assigned to publishers to associate with journal articles. Crossref holds metadata on those journal articles, which it makes available via its API. And it too has its heroes. Ed Pence and Jeff Builder, between them, have really done marvelous things at Crossref for the whole community, and I want to acknowledge their contributions. Often quiet and behind the scenes and done while maintaining impartiality to the views of different publishers. So let me move now to talk about the Initiative for Open Citations. This is a collaboration between various groups to promote the unrestricted availability of citation data. It had its formal launch in April of this year. And it was spearheaded by Dario with help from a number of us, including Mark and Katrina sitting here with me. So there were 6 founding organizations. And what it managed to do, what particularly Mark and Katrina managed to do by persuasively talking to other publishers, is to persuade publishers, which now include the majority of the large scholarly publishers, to open their citation data that they were already submitting to Crossref, resulting in an increase of the proportion of that citation data held by Crossref that is now open, rising from 1% to almost 50%. And this is an ongoing process. A large number of publishers, including commercial publishers, university presses, learned societies, and so on, are now supporting this initiative. And a large number of other organizations and institutions, including funders and research organizations and scholarly libraries and so on, are now supporting and endorsing the activities of the Initiative for Open Citations. And we thank them very much for that. So what's left to do? Isn't it a done deal? Well, almost 50% of the Crossref deposited citation references from about 60 million articles, so that's a lot of references, are now open, leaving about half, a little over half, that are still closed. Crossref has over 7,000 members, and it's the long tail of small publishers that we now need to persuade to open their references. And I have to say, this includes a large number of open access publishers, who, some of whom are represented at this meeting. So the point I want to make is this. If we are going to amalgamate citation data into useful databases where it can be cross-searched and employed to visualize citation networks and so on, it's no good just publishing your open access paper on your own publisher's website and thinking that's enough because your reference lists are open. Think of the effort that would be involved in someone trying to amalgamate these data, having to go to your website and everybody else's website every time a new journal issue is published and scrape the articles, which would appear in different formats and different DTDs and so on. That isn't going to work. What we need is for everyone to start releasing their references through Crossref. And a majority of publishers are members of Crossref and do assign DOIs to their articles. This is the industry standard. Of course, there are some that are not even members of Crossref. But help is at hand, I'm assured, by the good people of OASPA, that they will assist small scholarly publishers who are already OASPA members to join Crossref and will subsidize the cost of the DOIs that they then get assigned and will enable them to open their reference list from their DOI-labeled articles into Crossref. So please, if you haven't done this and you're here in the room and are wondering about this, get in touch with OASPA and ask for their help. How do you actually do it physically? How do you open your references to Crossref? Well, Crossref has a service called Cited By, and this enables you as a publisher to determine how well your journal articles are being received in the world, how frequently they're being cited. To calculate these metrics, Crossref needs to have everybody's citations so it can start to look at the information flowing between them, who cites whom. And so as a quid pro quo for this free service, publishers send their reference lists to Crossref. But by default, these reference lists are closed so as not to offend anyone's sensibilities. Making them open is trivially easy. Either you send an email to support@crossref.org saying, please open my reference lists, or you modify one of the elements in the metadata you send to Crossref with your journal metadata, putting the reference distribution option to any. So it's as easy as that. There's no excuse that this is technically difficult. It takes an effort of will on behalf of someone who has authority in that publishing house to make that decision and do it. And I would encourage you all to go home and treat this as one of your to-do items from this conference. Make sure your reference lists are open, and if they're not, either follow these simple steps if you're already participating in the Cited By service, or join Crossref's Cited By service for free and do that, or contact OASPA and ask them to give you a hand. Right, now, just to exemplify how that Crossref Cited By service can be useful, I've done a screenshot of a page from Zukeys. Yuba Penev was unable to make this meeting. I was expecting to see him here and catch up, but he sent me an email saying he was prevented from coming, but he sent me a list to this, so I thought I'd show it to you. Here's a paper from 2011. There's some introductory information on the left, and on the right are the references with links from Crossref showing how many times each of those cited references has been cited by other people. So this is just an example of how this all works together. Now I want to move on to my other topic, the OpenCitations Corpus. This is a small infrastructure organization directed by myself and Silvio Peroni, and its prime purpose is to host and develop the OpenCitations Corpus, which is a database for citation data recorded in RDF as open link data. So we wholeheartedly adopt the semantic web model. We are a founding member of the Initiative for Open Citations, and indeed, behind the scenes, we host their website. But we are distinct and separate from that initiative, and that initiative is quite independent from Open Citations. Way back in the distant past, I got a grant from JISC in the UK to develop a prototype OpenCitations Corpus. And this we did in Oxford, and I talked about this in my COASP talk in Riga 4 years ago. Since then, we have completely redesigned the corpus, throwing away all the initial software, redeveloping it from scratch, and rehosting it, this time not in Oxford, but in Bologna, the University of Bologna. And all the heavy lifting of this has been done by Silvio Peroni, to whom I'm eternally grateful. This has been ingesting citation data, reference lists, since the middle of last year. And we now have currently ingested the reference lists from about 250,000 articles, and they contain about 10 million citation links to over 5 million target publications. These are all freely available under a CC0 public domain waiver in RDF. So it's a start. As I'll go on to tell you, we're not there yet. At present, we're getting these references by parsing the XML of the open access subset from PubMed Central. So the references mainly come from biological articles. When we do that, we link to the most recently published papers first. We hold a list of those that we've already processed. And so most of the citing papers that we have come from this year and last year. Having got that metadata, we then go, particularly with any identifiers contained in the reference lists, to Crossref, to ORCID, and try and enrich our metadata with additional information. Now, there are about 1.7 million articles in the open access subset of PubMed Central, and so far we've harvested about 14%, so we have a way to go. This is what a typical reference list looks like. Here is the citing papers metadata and identifiers, and here is just one reference from the reference list with its author's title and so on, and its identifiers. And this is what we now take and parse into RDF. We do that using the SPAR, semantic publishing and referencing ontologies that Silvio and I developed over the last several years. And in particular, we use these three ontologies: Fabio, the bibliographic ontology; Cito, the citation typing ontology; and Biro, the bibliographic references ontology. And these allow us to describe everything we need to do concerning these citations in machine-readable code using recognized standards. All our software is openly available on GitHub, and the data in the corpus can presently be downloaded or accessed in 3 different ways. You can either make HTTP requests for individual items, or you can query our Sparkle endpoint, or you can go to Figshare and download from our monthly dumps. So every month we dump the entire corpus and its various subsets to Figshare, and from there people can get it. We use a good graph-based triple store called BlazeGraph, but that at present runs on a rather underpowered virtual machine at the University of Bologna Department of Computing. And that gives problems for us, or for our users at the moment, when challenging SPARQL queries are submitted, because the response time is very low. Fortunately, we have had recent funding from the Sloan Foundation to buy new hardware. This has been purchased, it will be commissioned very soon, and it should provide a better user experience for us. We are also, with that funding, going to develop additional user-friendly interfaces, including graph visualization tools to allow people to access the citation graphs present within the corpus in ways that we can't do now. There has been a steady and growing interest in the OpenCitations website, and most of those accesses have been either to our SPARQL page or to our corpus page, showing that most of the people coming to the site are interested in getting their hands on the data. We have also seen a steady number of downloads from our Figshare dumps. There was a spike in March of this year that we don't know. We think some robot was repeatedly downloading our stuff for reasons we're not aware of. But we're happy the data is available. And then our Twitter account and our blog post have had steady accesses, but there was a spike in the summer that followed the launch of the initiative for Open Citations. We gained a lot more Twitter followers then, and these things are available for people to study what we're doing. We don't know all the people who are using our data yet. Here are some of the projects we know are using our data for different things. Wikidata, for example, is pulling citations and using those to enrich their wiki pages. OpenAir are pulling citation information and using those to enrich their holdings. There's a project that's just starting in Germany, in Mannheim, the linked Open Citations database, which is going to harvest social science citations by text mining books. They have already adopted the Open Citations data model as a way of storing their information. And then there are a number of other things. The one research paper that we know is coming out of this is from Poland. Anna Kaminska sent a preprint just the other day showing how she is using the citation data available in Open Citations to do citation network analysis of some PLOS One papers. So there's a nice sort of completion of a circle there. But we can't know who is using our data unless you tell us. So if any of you are using our data, please let me know. Crossref blogged about our use of their REST API the other day, and so there's something else there that is a very nice circle. Well, what's our present status? As I said, we've recently received a small grant from the Sloan Foundation. This has allowed us to purchase this new hardware and also to appoint a postdoc, Ivan Hebe, and he has just been appointed and will start work in a few days with Silvio in Bologna. And the first thing that they will do together is to commission our new hardware. At the moment, we have one server that both ingests and then processes and stores in RDF our ingested data. The new model is that we have a more powerful central server that will do the latter part of that, and then 30 Raspberry Pis that will sit feeding data to that server, each of them harvesting independent references in parallel from Crossref, from PubMed Central. We're also, for the future and for our guidance, this relates to a previous talk in this session, appointing an advisory board to guide our growth, because at the moment we're very small. We have at the moment an ingest rate of about 8 million new citations per year. We hope with this new hardware to increase that 30-fold, and then we'd be getting about 240 million new citations a year. So by the end of next year, we should hold about 250 million citations, a quarter of a billion. This compares to Web of Knowledge's 1.25 billion. Even this partial coverage will include citation of all the most important papers in every field, because these will get citations, many citations from other papers, and can be easily recognized in the citation graph. If we were able to achieve a further 5-fold increase in ingestion rate, significant but achievable with a little more hardware and funding, we would be able easily to reach parity with Web of Science by 2020. Where will these references come from? I've told you at the present we're harvesting from the open access subset of PubMed Central. With our enhanced citation rate, we will quickly consume all of those papers. And then we will turn to all these new references that have now become available at Crossref, thanks to the initiative for open citations and the good graces of many, many publishers. And that will be a very wonderful coverage of the scientific world. But there are other sources of citations too. Archive, CiteSeer, CiteEc are all places where citations can be harvested from. I'm also very keen to harvest citations from the legacy pre-digital era by text mining reference lists out of page images. This is being done by two groups, LockDB I've already mentioned, and the BioStore that Rod Page has created for biodiversity information. So, in conclusion, we're winning the battle for open scholarship. And I've given here contacts to many of the significant people in that, and encourage any of you who have further interest, please to contact us. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, David. So we're going to eat into 5 minutes of coffee time. So for anyone who's got any question to any of the speakers, please go ahead.
David, are you going to do some authors disambiguation?
Are we going to do what?
Authors disambiguation, so resolution of authors identifiers. Maybe.
Well, we are gathering orchids as far as we can. We think that is the way to go for author disambiguation. At the moment, our concentration has been on ingest and getting some content, and building services over that content. We will do some of that, but it's also open for others to build creative and cool services over the content. That's the whole point of having it open. So no, we have no immediate plans for author disambiguation.
But the author disambiguation is, occurring in other places. So what the case that we make to publishers to do this, the subscription publishers, for open access publishers, there really is no case to make, it's obvious. But for subscription publishers, there's also a very strong case, because what this sort of availability of the citation graph will do will help to, derive discovery of content, regardless of whether it's open or closed. And going to those, so that's what it's about, is sort of studying that citation graph the author disambiguation will be occurring at the publisher's site if they're using ORCIDs or other resources or whatever.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone. I think you can go and have coffee. And many thanks to all the speakers.